Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the VRU's second webinar, where we're looking at various different issues relating to violence and the kind of world of post-COVID and some of the impacts that we have and some of the challenges that we face just now. Today, I'm joined with an amazing panel to look at youth violence, to look at the challenge, as I said, the challenge we face today, but also the challenge we face tomorrow in this, because it's going to be difficult. It's going to be complex. We're potentially dealing with a world where there's going to be less funding. We're dealing with services where people are going to be stressed and strained. We're looking to help and support and work with young people to give them the best chance in life. So today I'm joined by Darryl Lyons, who is an inspector with Northamptonshire Police, who runs the award-winning SVRU programme, and SVRU's based off the Boston Ceasefire Gangs Intervention Programme, where we look to try and work with young men and women to help them get away from gang life. We're also joined by Whitney Isles, who is the CEO from Project 507, who is just fabulous. She's been described to me as a force of nature. And I would probably agree with that. We were having a chat beforehand where I was just remarking on how much academic work and qualifications and jobs that Whitney has. And then we're also joined by Graham Armstrong, who's from Airdrie, looking to help and support. Graham's a writer of notes now, who's now got a best-selling book. He has been, I don't know if it's kindly or unkindly described as the next Irving Welsh, but actually we can see from that. But I'm delighted that Graham's joined us today, because obviously we can talk about that from his growing up and how it's reflected in his writing and his studies as well. So it should be an interesting conversation today. What we're looking for as well is we're looking for you to take part. We're looking for questions from the audience. We're looking for your ideas, your thoughts on what people do. We're going to keep this as fluid as possible, whereby we can stimulate as much conversation and debate as well. Because having conversation and debate on these issues is really important, because there's not one person, there's not one organisation, there's not one service that has all the answers. And only by exploring them in an honest, truthful way, whereby we can start to explore some of the problems and challenges that we face, and we can start looking for solutions. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce each one of my panel members to give just a few moments on who they are, what they do, what they'd like to talk about today. We'll do a few quick questions with each one, and then we'll go into some group discussions, at which point we'll be looking for questions from yourselves, but we also have some questions here as well, just to sort of kick off the conversations. So I'd like to introduce Darryl Lyons, and for Darryl to kick us off today.
Thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm an inspector, as Will has introduced me, who works in the SVRU programme in Northamptonshire. For anyone who's not aware of Northamptonshire, we're right in the middle of the UK. The only things we're really known for that are positive is Silverstone is here, the race circuit. Lady Diana Spencer's family is from Northamptonshire, and SVRU is also now from Northamptonshire. So I've been a police officer for 14 years, and SVRU was born out of a real frustration that we were doing bad things to people that had often very difficult and challenging upbringings, and I was a sergeant based in an area in Northamptonshire of high deprivation, and we had a massive explosion in youth violence and gang issues a number of years ago, and the police do what they always do, which is about looking at it through their lens about how they can manage the problem, and chiefly at the time the decision making that the police officers got who's dealing with the problem is either to arrest or not arrest, and that wasn't sufficient in terms of trying to help some of the young people, because it's mostly young boys that are involved in those issues in those areas. So by happenstance, I happened to be invited up to the violence reduction unit in Scotland. It was, and I say purely chance, because it was someone was poorly and there was a space on the plane, and it was already pre-booked. So I went to go and see Will and John Carnican and Cam McCluskey. My view on policing changed that day. I met James, who works with you guys up in the VRU, and I thought there's a better way that we can manage the issues that we've got in Northamptonshire. So we started a small program before SVRU's iteration, because SVRU in Northamptonshire started in February 2019, and we've now got a really fantastically good team that includes people with lived experience, family support workers, careers advisors, police officers, social workers, all sorts of different people that come together to have a solution-based, action-focused response to some of the issues we're seeing about chiefly young people getting dragged into county lines, drug carrying, weapon possession, all of those kind of things. And rather than look at us using the long arm of the law and the swift justice that comes with it, we're looking at how we can be more problem focused and offer them hope and a way out. And my team respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to people who are in need, and we respond as best we can in their teachable moments, no matter how many times it takes to go and try and change them. And our strapline is it's never too late to change, and we keep persevering and persevering and persevering to try and improve the lives of the young people working with along the line that they want to take their own life.
Excellent, thank you, Daryl. Okay, just on that, Daryl, I mean, obviously we've known each other for quite a while in terms of since you visited the VRU. What practical advice would you give to someone that wanted to move away from gang life or from the violence life? I mean, how can you help support that?
I can. Are you speaking for Northamptonshire or somewhere generally across the country? Because I think
talk from your personal experience.
I think it depends on who you've got around you. And if I talk from Northamptonshire's perspective, is you now have an increasing awareness of this is really multifaceted, and there needs to be someone to help you out of this position that you're in. The more that people become aware, and this includes professionals through to individuals who are involved in themselves, the better the chances you can be able to come out of that. So, for example, someone teaching staff could be looking at someone who's brought a weapon into school, and I think historically the view would have been that person's an offender. And I think there's a greater understanding now across various sectors about let's look at the reason why this occurred in the first place, and look at how we can potentially address what is effectively a symptom of the problem that's presenting itself. There's loads and loads of good people that want to help people out across the country, and you've got just a few in your panelists today in terms of people that want to help. There's huge amounts of people out there. I suppose my plight is to the professionals out there who should be doing more, I think, and should be action focused and looking at how we can look at this problem through a better lens, and not just look about how we can use what we've got in our toolbox as professionals. How can we build relationships with others, the people trying to support? And that's been the biggest lesson I learned and what I took from the VRU and meeting you guys was about the importance of relationships. And I think that we've tried to professionalize everything, and everything has to fit into a particular box. And then along came Serve, and what I saw from the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, I thought we've misplaced a lot of this, and where relationships are actually really, really important and first and foremost. So I think if it's for people across the country, what advice I'd give is look towards the people that you can form a good relationship with, and see if you can lean on them in terms of there'll be people out there that want to help you, but then might not necessarily be the most obvious people. There might be just people that you've met at your local youth club or anywhere that you've got a good relationship with somebody, and I think that's the starting point.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the phrase "not obvious people," because obviously you guys at Service struck up a relationship with Lisa Lashes and the creative industries in terms of that. How important it is to start to look at what the different options that young people want in life, rather than sometimes we try and prescribe, and how we can help them, and how we need to listen. So how important is having those different types of relationships rather than the kind of standard ones with social work or education, etc.
To have some hope and ambition is hugely important. And what we found with a lot of the young people we work with, and I say young people, is there's no upper or lower age limit to people we work with. But it happens to be, from referrals we get into us, most of them sit around 14 to 18. But without aspiration and hope, and again, this is something I took from you guys, it's so important to have that. And it shouldn't be about what's convenient for us, should it? It shouldn't be, I've got someone in the construction industry, therefore I'm going to push it towards the construction industry. It's about them. It's not about me and what's convenient for me. So we employ somebody that goes and looks for the diversity in those opportunities, so we can be that diverse and put people into those various industries. Lisa Lashes is a unique partnership we've got. They really like what we did. We like what they did. And it was a natural partnership struck up. But they've got huge access to world-class individuals within the entertainment sector and others, which means we can diversify our offer even further. And what we found is that music and the creative arts really did grab the people we're trying to support. We had fabulous engagement with them, and we saw huge change. And so I remember one of the first weeks that I was that went down the club where there's running the program from. They were telling me about two individuals from opposing gangs were having an argument about maths, as opposed to any of the previous street-based issues that we expected them to be squabbling about whilst in that session. So it had clearly broken down some barriers, and having some of those really inspirational people that can help them on hand was absolutely vital. But it's not just creative industries. We've got people across all sorts of sectors, and if someone that we pick up, we don't have access to a sector that we've already got a relationship with, we'll go and start to form that relationship in order to get them what they need and what they want, as opposed to say to what's convenient for us.
Brilliant. Thanks, Darryl. I'm going to introduce Graham just now. For Graham to give us a couple of minutes. Basically, just tell us a lot about himself, perhaps his journey. We'll leave that up to Graham, and then we'll kind of just a few quick questions and a quick chat with Graham. Graham.
Good afternoon, guys. Absolute pleasure to join you today. For those that don't know, my name's Graham Armstrong. I'm the author of The Young Team, and that is the fictionalised account of me being in gangs in North Lanarkshire in near Dreamcoat Bridge. That's how I spent my teenage years. Most recently, in the last 6 months or so, I've started joining the wider violence prevention community in Scotland. So visiting prison with Natalie McLean, who's the CEO of Cisco, and attending recovery cafes, which is a space where men serving long-term sentences talk about drug addiction in a safe space, which is it's based on a 12-step fellowship, and then visiting local schools and building relationships with teachers in order to talk about, not only talk to children about violence and drugs, but also to talk about building ACE awareness and trauma awareness within the staff. So that's been my journey from lived experience into an academic circle, going to university, writing about my own experiences, and then now progressing into talking about it in an academic way and joining the debate.
And about the Young Team, Graham, you talk about misconceptions and somehow people are recruited or seduced, I think the phrase is, into gangs. What was your experience?
I think, which is different from other parts of the world, by the way, there's no formal initiations where we were from. And I've told this story and people often laugh. The first time I ever heard of our gang, I thought it was a football team. You know, someone had said, "Are you going to join the Young Team?" And I said, "What's that? Is it a football team?" And everybody laughed and they went, "No, it's a gang. My big brother's in it." And I didn't even know there was gangs in my area, you know. But obviously I learned the hard way that wasn't the case. And it was just a case of we were emulating people who we seen that were older than us. And we thought this looked like great fun. We started taking the bad route, going into drugs and alcohol. Then that quickly morphed into violence. And then that predictable road to nowhere, you know, where it eventually became people losing their lives, becoming serious drug addicted, etc. You know.
When you talk about that, Graham, and again, I suppose this is reflected in the narrative of your book, and you know, from your whole story, in the final, almost the final act, and it's all about redemption to a degree. Yeah. So, I mean, what does that mean from you personally? But actually, are we a society that accepts redemption?
Redemption's a funny one, right? Because I heard John Carnochan, who was the co-founder of Violence Reduction, say redemption's an old idea, but it still works. And for me, I think redemption's coming full circle. You know, it's coming from someone who was involved and who took from their community. You know, I wouldn't be sit here and be too righteous. You know, and people say often, "Oh, son, you were just in with the wrong crowd." I think that's a kind of absolution of guilt. You know, and I often say immediately that, you know, I was one of the wrong crowd back then, but I'm not anymore. You know, and I think something happened this week, you know, that really brought that into highlight. So this woman, and I've asked her permission to tell this story. She contacted me to say she'd read The Young Team, and her brother had been in prison. He was caught with a knife in his community. He was given a short-term sentence, and she'd read my book, and she'd said to the boy, his name was Joseph, he said, "You need to read this book. You know, this guy, he's changed his life. This is going to change your life. You need to read it. It's made such an impact on me." And I'm very, very sad to tell you that Joseph was released from prison this week, and 2 days later he took a fatal overdose of street Valium. So he never got to read The Young Team. And I was very saddened to hear that, you know, and his sister had messaged me and reached out to say this. So I went down to her door the other night with a book for her other brother, who she's worried about now because of this trauma. And we spoke for an hour at her door, and I left and I thought, redemption's not always a picnic, guys. Sometimes it involves doing really hard stuff, but I felt like this is full circle for me, sitting in a panel with operational police officers talking about the issues, when I was part of the problem. Hopefully now you're part of the solution.
Thank you, Graham. If we're talking about then going back into communities, and you've mentioned this again previously, the fact is of being accepted back in the communities and the communities you've done, in your words that you may have harmed or you may have been part of the problem and people saw you as part of the problem, and this again feeds into the redemption issue for it, and actually that feeling of forgiveness and trust, etc., and allowing people to grow past and grow from where they were. How can we help communities and help individuals actually heal the bonds?
I think one of the phrases that I heard you guys use, it was this lethal absence of hope, and I think that's the catalyst for a lot of these behaviours, and I think for me, my diversion started when I found hope, and I found that in a work of literature that I thought reflected my life, so. And I think, by the way, that's one of the main issues that these young men don't have. They don't have anything to hope for. They don't have anything to strive for. So how do they then feel part of something bigger that we can call a community if they don't have any personal hope for growth? They get this devil-may-care attitude, because life's tough and nothing's going their way. They can't get a job. So the only thing that they find family or commune in is drugs and alcohol and violence. So I think programs like the Violence Reduction Unit and other enterprises worldwide that make a bridge between the past and the future for people, that's how we reconnect, that's how we rebuild.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Graham. Thanks. Whitney. Now, said at the Whitney at the very beginning, as a force of nature, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time in relation to this. No pressure at all, Whitney. Would you like to just give us a couple of minutes?
So I run Project 507. It was created almost by accident. It wasn't a plan. So I've been a kind of frontline practitioner, youth worker for the last 18 years. About just under 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of work just out in the community, not through any particular organization, just doing it off my own back. I'm not gonna act like it was professional in any way, shape or form. I really was kind of in the grassroots. And I had a lot of kind of good relationships in the community and was doing a lot of work with a lot of young people that would be considered high risk. And due to this, I found myself in a meeting one day where, gang interventions were needed. And, good old Gary Trailsdale, if you've ever heard of him in London, which many people have, all of a sudden just sat there and went, oh, actually, I brought Whitney into this meeting to run or to talk to you about these gang interventions for the prison estate. I was completely unaware at the time that that's why I was in the meeting for, but I am always one to take up an opportunity. So at the time, I explained the work that I did, and within the next few months, ended up working in YOY Feltham. And if you've ever kind of worked in a prison or worked in Feltham, it's it's definitely the deep end to get thrown into. So I found myself, 24 years old, given keys to a prison and a nice contract, and basically told, do what you feel is right. So worked with a lot of the guys in there and kind of the guys that I knew out in the community, to create interventions that weren't necessarily around offending behavior, but were around kind of almost psychoeducation, like, who are you, how do you understand yourself, know thyself, and also creating things that were exciting to me, and what I knew was interesting, and what I would kind of speak to my peers about, or the kind of the younger guys. I had like 1,000,001 little brothers at the time. So kind of growing up and growing into it, having a business, and doing the work and understanding the criminal justice system, it was a huge learning curve. And a couple years later, I started really starting to study psychotherapy. So I'd come from a complete kind of grassroots, this is my community, these are my people, this is where I've come from, let me just do the work, to actually I want to understand this a little bit deeper, because I could see, and I knew from my own experience of trauma and from growing up in the same neighborhoods that, a lot of us had been through a lot of really bad things, and that was affecting us. But I wanted to put the clinical language on it, so I wanted to understand, and I wanted to develop myself. So started to do a lot more around kind of understanding psychotherapy, trained at the Tavistock and Portman Clinic, really put that investment in, and was thinking, actually, these places are great, but they also don't represent the young men that I work with. You do work at the Portman Clinic. Portman Clinic is amazing, but it's very much around, but definitely at the time, sexual offences and sexual delinquency and violence, and working with young white boys. And a lot of the young men that I was working with, a lot of young black, young brown, and even kind of the young white boys we were working with, coming from a different kind of cultural background, a different understanding. So I wanted to kind of do a lot more work in how do we write about this? How do we challenge the dialogue? How do we challenge the narrative whilst doing the work? And Project 507 has grown out of that. And traditionally, we've done a lot of work around violence reduction, and then that grew into looking at state violence and how policies and procedures and systems can generate the violence on the ground, to then kind of doing a lot more work around, okay, this is trauma work that we're doing. A lot of this is trauma work. So we have to challenge the systems, we have to challenge the narrative and develop the narrative, but we also have to start doing work around trauma. And that's led me more recently. So last year, I just completed a master's from SOAS in violence, conflict and development, because I was really interested in learning from the global south and what's happening in conflict zones across the world, and how peace is then generated. So rather than thinking about violence reduction, thinking about how do we create peace? What does peace look like? Because a lot of the times we think about violence reduction, but we don't put anything else in place, or we don't deal with the root causes. And the same with behavior, we don't deal with the root causes a lot of the time. So completed that last year, to now moving forward and continuing wanting to push the narrative and develop as a academic, and kind of do more action research and pulling things together, and now doing work around naturopathic nutrition and biomedicine, and I'm studying neuroscience at King's, neuroscience and mental health, because I'm really interested in how trauma not only kind of sits in the mind but also affects the body and the brain, and what's the links between the whole, and how can trauma manifest in disease, and then also kind of matching that with the systemic violence stuff. So actually, if we're sending a load of traumatized children, for example, into the prison estate, the prison estate itself is quite a traumatic place, and it denies a lot of young people of good nutrition, for example, healthy water. How does this all have an impact kind of on their bodies and on their development? What does it mean to be in a high intensive situation where you are always on guard, where your amygdala is always on high alert, where the adrenaline and the cortisol is always pumping through your body? Therefore, if you've always got blood pumping in your heart into your limbs, the first thing it's going to do is affect your digestive system. If it affects your digestive system, it's going to affect your immune system. So actually, it's the perfect breeding ground for long-term health kind of disadvantages. And we know that from ACEs. We know that if people have been through trauma as children, they are more prone to have kind of different difficulties later on in life. And there's also a kind of social construct and structure around that as well. So my interest is, how do we take that a step further and say, actually, by putting children that have been traumatized in prison, we're almost kind of making that problem tenfold, increasing that problem tenfold. So I'm really interested in how these different fields can complement each other when we can bring them together. And in relation to Project 507, now, moving that forward from a place of violence reduction to how do we create alternatives, rather than kind of, having conversations with the prison system over and over again. What can we do to create these alternatives in the community? How do we use some of the lessons that we've learned from the global south to heal trauma in different ways, which isn't coming from a westernized perspective as well?
Fantastic, thank you, Whitney. So many questions off the back of that. So many. Okay, I'm going to start with trauma. It's because we know, I mean, we chat between all of our conversations so far. Trauma has featured quite heavily in what we've been talking about. But I'm actually going to talk of where we are in this, because the evidence around trauma has been around since the mid-90s in terms of what we're doing. Really, the first real big evidence base coming from the Californian study looking at, which was then eventually termed ACEs, but obviously trauma had been aware of that beforehand and the impact, stress, etc. Why is it taking so long before we actually start doing stuff with this? Because we're trauma aware, So if we're trauma aware, how do we become trauma informed? And if we become trauma informed, how do we take that into our action and our policies?
My opinion on this is, when we deal with trauma, so many of us are ill-equipped to actually deal with it and think about it, because it's hard work. And actually, you know, it takes a toll on us. So even if we don't have our own kind of traumatic experiences, just thinking about trauma and the trauma that other people have experienced, and if we are kind of have empathy towards that, actually that will take a toll on our own emotional and kind of mental and spiritual health as well, and well-being. So a lot of these conversations are really difficult to have. But also there's the other element that our systems become very stuck in their ways. And systemically, even individuals that can be, you know, think really creatively and want to kind of make changes, they're still stuck in a system that is narrow in its thought processes. So you can only do so much when you're working within the system, because the system, you know, it creates a lot of the problems. So how can you use the same thinking that creates the problems to create the solutions? It doesn't quite work like that. And, you know, my stance is, I am moving further and further away from the system in order to have that freedom to create, to build evidence, to actually then go back and say, rather than just wasting my energy yelling at you guys, which I'm known to do a little bit, a tiny bit, you know, actually let's, you know, this is action research. This is an evidence-based project that we've done. Because you can sit in meeting after meeting after meeting saying the same things, and everyone in that meeting can have, you know, a good heart and good intentions, but the actual systemic structures themselves almost are at a point now where a lot of them need to be just torn down and restructured.
I've changed my thinking in that way around trauma recently, because I've experienced trauma and I didn't even really realise, I didn't ever acknowledge it in my own life, you know, and then I started working in stressful employment. And I was like, why am I not coping the way these other guys are? You know, why am I finding this a lot more difficult? And I was thinking, because you've had a hard past, you know, the stuff in gangs and drug addiction, you know, trauma's a snowball and it comes back to haunt you, you know, it's when other traumas come, and, you know, and recently guys that are dealing with this stuff, you know, and I wondered, I'm like, why are they talking about meditating in a prison? You know, what's the point in that? But the point is because guys like me go around telling stories, right? We tell about the worst things that have happened to us, and then we expect that shock value or the cautionary tale element for people to go, you know what, that guy's in a bad life, I don't want that for me, I'm going to take a different path. But that's not the reality. And I've experienced, when you tell that to young men, you know, the attitudes come up and they go, that's not going to happen to me. And lots of these professionals like Gerald Neal, like Natalie McQueen, they're emphasising meditative practices, you know, and it's engaging with spirituality, because when they tell the trauma and then they leave, they want to give kids and other people and offenders and people in jail a toolkit that when that bad trauma comes, you know, and you've got the physical manifestation of it, which is stress, anxiety, panic, you know, the meditative practice can bring that down. And if you can manage the physical side, it gives you a fighting chance at dealing with the long-term effects of, you know, said trauma. So I'm totally buying into it. I'm doing it myself now, and I think it is helping, you know. And I think if we can teach kids that at a young age, we move in from being trauma reactive to being trauma proactive.
That's a good point, Graham. I mean, and I suppose it comes to, you know, one of the other points, and again, we were kind of chatting this a little bit pre-start to the event, and it's around about the Richard Rohr quote is saying, if we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. So if we're looking at trauma from the trauma that we face ourselves, but actually the systemic trauma that we have in our communities, the trauma that's passed down intergenerationally, and also the trauma that actually we might feel within our organization and organizational trauma, because we have all of that in this mix that affects our decision making. How do we start to deal with that, you know, so that we're not transmitting the problems that we have to ourselves? Anyone want to pick up?
I mean, I think that's a very kind of complex thought process as well. There's not a kind of one size fits all answer with that, but it is about, you know, doing the work and doing the hard work. You know, us as individuals, as practitioners, for example, it's about processing our own work and processing how the work affects us, and creating cultures kind of within our organizations that are mindful of that. You know, within Project 507, as an example, we have kind of almost kind of trauma informed policies. So we know if there's been a major incident, a member of team can have up to 5 days off, and it won't be taken out of their annual leave, and it won't be marked as sick, because it's part of their, what they deserve to process the physical element of experiencing that trauma. And then they get access to, clinical supervision fortnightly. They get, if they wanted additional therapeutic support, then we can, talk about that, and we can put that in place. So it's about a lot of kind of changing culture and flexibility of working. We've, as a society, become very caught up in capitalism and the 9-to-5 structure, and a lot of that is also about, I'm very much around ripping apart some systems, and just the way that we think and the way that these systems have been developed do not take into consideration people's health and well-being first and foremost, let alone if they're then dealing with trauma. So it is really about confronting the difficulty and the challenging kind of conversations that need to be had around all of this, and not being frightened to make changes.
And Daryl, can I bring you in on this? I mean, obviously, as a operational police officer, you would have seen your fair share of trauma, and you would have been personally affected by things. Obviously, I'm not looking for you to disclose anything, but as policing as an organisation acknowledge, the trauma that sometimes our operational officers face in terms of how that can manifest and how that can affect how they work?
I'll come to that in just a moment. I just want to pick up on Whitney's point, because it really resonated with me when she was talking about systemic issues and just being stuck in that talking phase. And that was what we found ourselves in. I was in meeting after meeting of talking about how we're going to do something, and it never realised any action, or the action was really lackluster. And I'm all for tearing stuff down to build it back up and doing things. And I think that's what we need to get far better at as services, and I include ourselves as police in that we need to get far better at see a problem, let's be brave, let's do something about it, and start making some brave decisions, and start rather than making excuses, let's start doing stuff that works and is right. And I think often as professionals we think we know best, we don't, and then we end up taking some action. It's often the wrong action, or we do worse and we pretend we're taking some action, or throw some buzzwords together, show an action plan to somebody, and actually it's made no difference at all. So I think we need to be better collectively at that, and not having a binary response to problems either it is or isn't a problem, or it falls into category A or category B. We need to be far better at looking at the grey, and making some more informed decisions. Back on, I suppose, trauma towards police then in general, they were pretty poor, I think, when I started 14 years ago dealing with trauma. If you're lucky, once you saw something that was pretty horrific, and of course on the front line, of which I spent 7 years as a frontline cop on response policing, you're exposed to some pretty horrific incidents, and I've been to everything you can imagine over that time. Now there's a more of an understanding about how that can affect you, and also how it can affect your evidence that you provide, because when you're in a traumatic state, your evidence you can provide in a written statement format can be corrupted. You're clearly trying to manage and deal with a lot of the issues and things you're feeling that you may have seen or experienced. So there's now thankfully a process that's come from police firearms training around post-incident management, where you're assigned a welfare single point of contact immediately after a significantly traumatic incident, and then they will then help you manage some of those feelings and experiences. And then also within Northamptonshire, I can only speak for Northamptonshire, but there's also peer support networks that have started to be incorporated. So for things that where there is exposure to trauma, and that can be anything that can manifest itself from something that may have happened in an individual teams with something that's happened in your home life, through to something you've been exposed to as a cop. They have now TRIM, so trauma-informed groups that can then make contact with you and help you progress and digest some of those feelings and experiences. I can only imagine how it must be for someone in the control room, because they've got to go straight from a call about a dog in the road to taking a call about somebody that's been killed and having to try and listen to that phone call. So it manifests itself in many different ways. In the team that we've got here, we had to invest in some support, as Whitney was describing, not to the same level. We need to look at that, but how we supported our staff members dealing with some of the people that are having some of their trauma explained to some of the navigators that we've got. I think there was some guilt feeling about whether, because they start to form a relationship with somebody, if that person then something happens to them, or they perhaps regress and they feel maybe partly responsible to that. There was certainly the officers and the navigators taking a lot more personal responsibility, because they weren't making a policy decision. they were making the decisions in the grey areas where they felt as though they're making the best decisions to progress that person forward, putting the right support in at the right time. It's all a fine art. So if something then didn't go the way they hoped it did, they took that what they perceived to be a failure, and it's quite to heart, and that was the trauma that we saw here. So we paid for some additional counselling staff and some support coaches to come in and defragment some of those conversations so they could still maintain and develop and grow and support the people we're looking to support.
Graham, the question coming in, I think this is quite an interesting question. I'd like you to try and pick this up. Is it how do we move away from how do we move towards self-mediation and away from self-medication?
Well, for somebody like me, it's a very complex question. For me, it was a black and white one. I had to stop using drugs. I was at crisis point, so I stopped using illegal substances. But there was one substance that I hadn't stopped using, and that was a big problem, which was alcohol. And I continued for another 3 or 4 years to drink. And people who have had a past, be that whatever aspect of trauma that is, whether it's gangs, being addicted, substance dependent, whatever, I think abstinence-based recovery is the way forward. Whether or not you acknowledge that you self-medicate or whether you acknowledge substance dependence doesn't always mean that it's not a factor, and certainly over my exposure to meditative stuff about controlling the way we feel, stress management, there's a lot of potential for people who feel that they need to use substances in pursuing a different, non-substance based recovery. And I've spoken about this before, but it's a holistic thing, healing, and it involves all sorts: diet, sport and exercise, social. You can't do this alone. Good socials, and these are not easy things. It takes a long time to build them all, but when you put those all together, that's where you get healing and that's where you get progress. But if you are still using drugs or alcohol, I think that your potential for progress is always hampered, because especially alcohol is a volatile thing. 49 times you can drink it at 50 and it's absolutely fine, and then number 50 something happens and it sets you back. So.
With that in mind, then, I mean, one of the things I'd like to discuss and perhaps explore a little bit is, do we judge young people by different standards? Are we quite, how can I put this, hypocritical about young people? Daryl?
Yes, we are. I'd say yes, we are. I think there's we did quite a lot of work with Professor Steve Peters, who wrote the Chimp Paradox book, and he did some work with us talking about how the brain develops. And I think you're saying, especially in young men, that often they don't reach a period of maturity until around 30. And so I think we often look, especially I've noticed that we do it especially as cops, is we look at something we perceive as being obvious in terms of the consequence, and then they go and do something, but they haven't seen that was the potential outcome of their decision. And I think there's clearly something in the brain that would make something different there. But also we're especially as cops, I'd say we're the furthest point away from some of the people we're trying to support, but we can view them from our own very specific view of the world, which is like, well, why on earth would you go and deal drugs? Obviously you're going to get caught and you're going to get arrested. And I think that some of those things that we need to start not looking at them in that particular way. And of course in Serve we're fortunate that we don't, but I think as a general population of professionals, I think we can often view young people to go and say, well, why on earth did they do that? I was once in an address with a family where a social worker said to a young mum, she goes, we're going to take legal advice in respect to your children, and she just shook her head and was like, yeah. And I said, you do realise what you're saying, don't you? She said, well, you're talking about taking your children off of you, but again we've used a professional language there that we've assumed they've understood, and this isn't necessarily just to young people, but we can make a lot of assumptions, I think, around how we put in our own projection of how we see the world on young people in particular, and then and judge them by that standard. And so we've had to educate ourselves to go and say that's not correct. We need to start trying to get into their shoes more, be more empathetic, more understanding, see where they're standing, and then see, well, why is it that they've made that decision? If it is indeed a decision, it could be like Graham said, that they've been had some alcohol in their system or some drugs or whatever, and they've gone and made a poor decision, or a decision that we perceive as poor, should I say, when actually we're not really understanding the trauma that they've gone gone through, the circumstances that they're in, and I think that became really apparent to me after we started to really unturned some of these stones about actually we've really made some poor judgment calls here in terms of how we view their world through our eyes.
I suppose that kind of comes to actually the kind of idea of young people. If young people are being judged by adults, how do, by people that don't necessarily understand what it's like to be young, how do we start to include not just young people in the conversation, but actually include them in decision making? Whitney, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's like everything. You listen, you observe, you reflect, and you co-create. All the best projects are projects that have been created with the people that they're for. It's not, it's not kind of by us for you, and it's not always necessarily even about the intervention or about the work itself. It's about how do you get to the point of doing the work? How do you get to the point of creating the intervention? And there needs to be, I think a big part of it is creating the skills to reflect on what's being said and be able to be in a room and be like, okay, we've said this word. Is everyone agreeing what this word means? Because a lot of us do that as professionals as well. We'll all sit in the meeting and we'll say gangs. And gangs is different to it will be different to every single one of us on this panel, So when it comes to working with young people, it's not about being tokenistic. It's not just like, oh, let's have a young person on our board. Let's, I was that young person, I've been doing this work since I was 15. So I've been through it all. And it's not just about the kind of tokenism of having a young person there. It's about how do we upskill? How do we create kind of invest in the critical thinking skills of this person? How do we also reflect with them on what is being said to ensure that it's really being thought about what's kind of being developed? I think I'm the perfect example of a young person that was highly invested in by my community. I represent my community and the investment of all the people that took the time to give me a book, to mentor me, and to invest in the way that my mind works. And I think that's the practice. It's not just sit in a room and tell us what you think. It's the same. I have the same issue with lived experience. Lived experience is extremely valuable, but it has to be lived experience that's processed and worked through. Otherwise, we're doing harm. We're not doing it for the right reasons, and it can cause a lot of harm to the individual, and it can cause a lot of harm to the work. And it has to be kind of thought about together. It's everyone has a part around the table in order to have difficult conversations, have that conflict, and work through something and create kind of policy change, create structure change, create interventions, create projects. So it should always be kind of done together, and it should always be thought through. And for me, it's not necessarily that what the intervention is, what that end project is. It's how do you get to that point?
Okay. Let me ask a much more kind of challenging question. It might be a much more challenging question for Daryl, so I might exclude Daryl from this question if he doesn't want to answer it. Does stop and search unfairly target street culture, and is it still relevant to today's practice? Graham, what do you think?
Yes, I think it does. Now, we hear about stop and search from London a lot, where it's highlighted in terms of racial profiling, whereas in Scotland, and I actually spoke about my mother with this, and she said, she almost laughed and went, "You get stopped and searched all the time." And I said, "I know, but it didn't offend me because I was exactly the kind of person who probably should have been stopped and searched at the time, And I thought to myself, if cops search you and find a weapon, right, was that stop and search justified? Absolutely. Absolutely it was, because that knife that they found early in the evening could be a murder scene by the end of the night, right? However, if you're talking in terms of race, down in London, down south, where, race plays a much bigger role in the way we stereotype and profile gang members. A kid wearing a North Face jacket that's black or brown, are they necessarily mandem or a roadman because they're wearing street coat? No, So if they're stop and searched, is that justified? Only if it's intelligence led. They're not automatically suspicious because of their colour, because of their fashion. And I think that's when it is misused, and that's when it causes offence, and it causes alienation, causes anger within already minority groups. In Scotland, where we were, I don't know anyone who was offended by stop and search unless they were caught with something.
Whitney, I'd like to bring you in this one.
I think similar views. What does street culture mean, and to whom? It's all about perception, and we do see a targeting of young black men. So but yes, intelligence-led stop and search, but we also have to think about what that intelligence is. And this has been one of the things that I've been challenging a lot in relation to intelligence from the police and intelligence in the security teams within the prison, because intelligence is also subjective as well. It's based on the experience of the person reviewing information. And what I've noticed, and what I actually did my dissertation on, in fact, was those of us who do kind of violence reduction work and community work that work with the young people that would be seen as the most high risk from the police, and how we can get targeted, and how there can be intelligence on us due to the work that we do, but also due to the kind of who we are within the community as well. And it's who's questioning that intelligence. And the perfect example, more recently, there's a video on the Forefront Project. Forefront Project is a youth-led community organization that looks at violence reduction and doing all of this work, and they do fantastic work. In April, I think it was, one of their workers, Kasai, who was in his he was in his uniform, he had his ID, and got stopped by 4 police officers, put in handcuffs, put in the back of a van, and was actually quite harassed if you look at the video itself. And these things shouldn't be happening to us for the fact that we do the work that we do. And there needs to be a respect, and there needs to be a bridge in that kind of relationship and communication. And how can us as community workers and community leaders then advocate for the police and advocate for better relationships with the police if we're being targeted ourselves? And this is happening over and over again, and you can see a lot of it happening coming up in the news now, a lot of and it's all based on intelligence. But if you actually challenge this intelligence, and I know that there's intelligence on me, and I've challenged it, and I've put my my data request through, and it's always like, oh, we can't tell you, we can't tell you, we can't tell you. So how can we form any kind of trust on developing these relationships with the police? How can we trust the intelligence that they're gathering on young people if where is that intelligence coming from, and who is it coming from, and how are we thinking about risk? There needs to be a huge piece of work around how do we think about risk, and how do we think about who is a risk, and how do we interpret behavior? Because I speak to my clinical supervisor about this a lot. There seems to be and I'm open to be challenged on this, but there seems to be, from my experience, that in relation to mental health, young white boys that are acting out in a particular way are more inclined to be seen as mad. I use that, whereas young black boys are more inclined to be seen as bad. So even if we look at mental health through a white lens, actually a lot of violence, we can interpret it from a trauma perspective and also from a mental health perspective. But if an officer, for example, isn't educated and isn't informed, or has an experience from outside of London, they're not going to be able to see that through maybe the same eyes that I would. So that behavior then might be suspicious behavior, that might be then collected as intelligence, which then might be used in a stop and search, which then might end up in a young man then being put in handcuffs and then being put on the floor because his behavior is quite abrupt. But actually a lot of this might be kind of mental health issues playing out. So just to take it a one step forward from what Graham was saying, I think we also need to challenge these ideologies or around intelligence and where intelligence comes from.
Sorry, just to come in, just very, very quickly on that. There's one thing that we ought to mention when we talk about stop and search is that, but it's a quantifiable, so it gives political capital to say we've had 10,000 more stop and searches, we've had 20,000 more cops on the street. But when you look at the definition of police by consent, it says one of the definitions of success is not the proof of crime being solved, but of the absence of crime. So when you look at the coronavirus response, we've had this hoo-ha about how many tests have been done because it's political capital, and that's the way it's used down south, by the way.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was speaking about before about systemic violence and how kind of our systems and our policies can generate the violence on the ground. So if a police officer is getting pressured to do a certain amount of stop and searches, then you go to where you think the evidence might be or the intelligence is located in, and you do the stops and searches there in order to get your numbers up, in order to prove that this is how the systems then can generate the violence on the ground.
suppose that brings me to a couple of questions to you, Daryl. Then one, probably in two parts. We'll start with the back end of the comments from Graham and Whitney there in relation to stop and search by numbers and the structural issues with that. Is that prevention is very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to quantify.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to justify, particularly from a policing context, when you're having to report on action, you're having to report on crime numbers, you're having to report on detection. How can we change that, or what do we need to do so that actually we're looking at outcomes? We're looking at actually how we're helping to support and change and work with communities rather than do any form of policing by numbers or social work by numbers. So we're not just simplistic in our approach.
Yeah, and I think some of the things I've looked at recently is about public confidence levels in policing, but that needs to be across all communities, of course, not just the ones that are surveyed. But from speaking from local experience in Northamptonshire, we haven't policed by numbers for the entire time I've been in the police. So for 14 years, not in Northamptonshire, we haven't. What has changed over time, though, I remember when I first joined, a stop search form was a tick box exercise. So you go through, and one of the tick boxes would have been sufficient that you're in high crime area, and clearly that's not proportionate or reasonable. So now there's far more pressure, rightly so, on the officers around legitimacy of the stop search. I think that's what the whole argument focuses around, is the legitimacy of the intelligence, the legitimacy of the use of the tool in the first place, because stop search is contentious whether you do it or whether you don't do it. If you stop doing it and then suddenly violence goes up in an area, it'll be a contentious issue about why they've not done it. So it's a really hard one to get right. But I think what's really important is that everything that should be explained should be explained. It should be a transparent process, and certainly in terms of use of intel must also be, there must be something present at the time for that. It can't just be historic intel that gives rise to that stop search in law. So there shouldn't be this. There's historic intel, and that's the only reason to do it. And it is, and as Whitley points out, it's really hard to make something that's a subjective decision from the officer and put it in objective terms for it to be part of that legitimate process, to then have some scrutiny as terms of whether the power was used correctly or not. And also, that everyone who's going to be stop search, I should imagine, is going to feel pretty aggrieved by the fact they've been stopped, liberty taken for the period that the search is ongoing for. It's a really difficult issue to terms of try and get right. In Northamptonshire, can I speak for what we do? It's about, we have panels that then review all stop searches with lay members of the public on those panels from diverse backgrounds and experiences, with cops too, and they go and then take to defragment the stop search grounds that gave rise to whether there was an objective basis as best they can be for the officer to search that person, so the public can have greater degree of confidence in our processes. And I think just lastly about it's the media exposure as well, is there's probably 100 good stop searches for every one bad, and that one bad is one too many, but it's that one bad one that of course gets played out in terms of the media, in terms of how someone's been racially profiled or whatever may be happening, and there to be some really negative experience of the police. And I think it's absolutely right that those things can then really undermine relationships that police have probably spent many years developing with those communities if the tool is not worked or used correctly.
And I just want to add as well in relation to how do you measure prevention. So, or one of the projects that I find really interesting, it's something called the peace indicators. I don't know if anyone's heard about it. So the peace indicators, it's about measuring peace, and how do you measure if there's peace in a community, and it's a process. So it's not an intervention. It's a process to create peace indicators, and that are specific to a particular community, and the interventions and the kind of solutions to the challenges are developed around the peace indicators. So if we know a peace indicator for London, for example, would be having bins everywhere, and especially bins that didn't have to be see-through. So we know that, that would indicate that we were on a low terrorist alert. And that's kind of might be more significant to London. If we were looking at smaller communities, it might be the fact that you can leave your bike outside of the shop. So every different community will have ingrained in them, just quite naturally, what we need to know in order to, that it's safe, that there's peace. Once we'll get to a point where we can start thinking about, okay, we're safe from COVID because we're not seeing everyone with masks on, we're not seeing gloves, we're not having to, be socially distanced, more than 20 people. There's little things that are ingrained in our culture and can be very unconscious a lot of times, that will indicate when our neighborhoods are safe. And actually, I think we need to be learning from these processes and learning that there are things out there that have been tested, that have been evidenced, that work that can show kind of what prevention looks like. And again, you do it with a community.
I suppose that kind of leads us a little bit. I mean, kind of talk about the kind of different solutions and different way of measuring for different communities. What we're seeing across the UK is a violence narrative. It's been driven by a media in terms of what the violence and what the problem is. But that's been driven from certain quarters, which possibly may or may not have certain agendas. But that will then impact upon how potentially we treat violence and how we deal with our communities across the country. So, what's your thoughts on that and how we start to sort of act against that and actually start to be more localized in our response and actually understand our problems at a local level? Graham.
Yep, sorry. I was already coming in on it. I think, especially your director, Niven Rennie of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, has been very vocal about some of the media using how the violence crisis down south has been reported on. When you talk about an agenda, I think in Scotland, we are the UK leaders on this stuff because we had it worst, historically. So we understand that showing young men images of weapons that we've seized, of knives, doesn't, it's not an LA Confidential style of policing where we bring photographers with police to show them now, that we realise that if we show the young men these weapons, it creates fear and that just drives more weapon carrying, So how do you get a positive away from that and into the good news stories? I'm not sure. And it depends what media outlets you look at because they will report it in different styles. If you look at an article in The Guardian about violence or gangs, it's always peer-led. They actually go and speak to people. If you look in some of the other papers, the more right-wing ones, they blame specific members of the community, specific classes, specific colours, etc. And we want to get away from that because violence, we often look at the symptoms, but actually the disease which we should be pursuing is inequality and poverty within all our society.
Whitney, would you like to come in?
Maybe slightly controversial, but I would ban the kind of posting of pictures and names, more so pictures, but anyone under the age of 25 that has committed a crime, I would put some more legislation involved in how that is kind of portrayed in the media. And I know a lot of people have a kind of very difficult views on that, or we need to know who's doing certain things in our community. But actually, working in the prisons and working with young men and young women that are coming out of the prison estate, how can you create a new identity is if you can go on Google, which a lot of them will do, type in their names and see their criminal profile. And I don't think it helps in the long term.
Darryl, any thoughts?
No, I quite agree, and that's something that we struggle with around the kind of rehabilitation journey for a lot of the people that we work with, is that can, departing from their history or people's view of their history, or trying to get people to change their mind, we find is often really difficult. It's trying to get people to have an open mind and not judge people by their past. So certainly what Whitney suggested there, I think would be really beneficial for certainly a lot of the people that are trying to move on from their histories. What was your original question? Sorry, just so I make sure I answer that too.
No, the question was actually looking at the differences across the country that's been generated by a narrative that's come out, say, out of the London-based media, saying that violence is like this, and how's that impacted on local delivery?
Yeah, I think also what it drives is if you see a spike, let's say, and we'll take an example. You said there's a spike in London of violence. The quick thing to do, and I think what most of the right-wing press would want to see, is swift justice, more boots on the street, locking people up. That's only going to be dealing with the symptoms of the issue we're talking about. What's a lot harder to do is find the right people to deliver the right solutions in a long-term basis, like what the panelists are talking about here. That's what the hard thing is to do, because you need good people that have good relationships and able to go and take that along. It's hard to do, but I think what it forces people into doing is we're going to have a task force and we're going to go and arrest, violence has got no hide in place, that kind of rhetoric that often isn't helpful, because it's just dealing with the symptom, and it suggests that arresting someone and sending them to prison is the answer. And actually, it's not. Of course, it's just going to often make things worse. So I think there needs to be it takes people off in a different direction where we're not really looking, I don't think sometimes genuinely, at preventative practice that's going to be dealing with a lot of the reasons that the violence presents itself in the first place. And I think that's a bit of a shame, because it should be prompting that discussion.
I mean, I like your idea about the under 25s, Whitney, in terms of, because obviously a lot of the evidence around brain development, etc., in terms of people growing up and reaching adulthood, it's not till about the age 23, 24. So there are some academic arguments for that. But this comes from an early question that we got quite early on in the conversation when we were using the phrase redemption with Graham. Someone responded by saying, well, redemption would have suggestions of badness or being saved. Surely this is about reintegration. And the challenge that we have with reintegration is, when does an offender, if we're going to use those labels, become an ex-offender, become a member of the public? When do we stop labeling people and start allowing them to actually rejoin society or whatever community that is? Graham?
I've had a personal experience of this. I went to Stirling University and I had presented my work on gangs, and they thought this is fantastic. And they said, we've got a programme running with one of the Scottish prisons, but there's only 2 guys we would put forward for it, and both of you have got criminal records, so you're not allowed. And I thought, and I put some thought to that, and I thought that's a real shame. I just felt like I was bursting with energy to do something good, and I was denied. And obviously I understand that there's protections, etc., PVG clearance and all that, but it felt then, right, that a criminal act that I did when I was 17, which was a glorified vandalism, right, was then continually a punitive measure. It was then going to curse me forever. And I still feel that way in some. Like, what's the purpose of a criminal record detailing, cannabis possession when someone's 16? If they might go into a school and positively impact young people, I feel like it's just a continual punitive cycle. Whereas actually, it's actually people with lived experience that have got great value to add to the debate.
I think also, though, Will, sorry, it's reintegration suggests they're integrated in the first place, which I think is often not the case. I think often people are marginalised for long periods of time, and to try and reintegrate them is probably not true. We're trying to integrate them because they've never actually been or felt as though they've been integrated in anything at all. That's something we've had to educate ourselves on in terms of how do we do that. And how do we get people involved and genuinely linked in with society as a whole? And that really resonates, Graham, in terms of, I had a conversation with somebody on Twitter last week where they were continuously going for jobs and getting knocked back, and were clearly a really good candidate. And it was only with this, when they got to the stage of disclosing their criminal conviction, that they then became knocked back in their journey to try and get employed. And it's kind of, you do your crime, you do your time, but then there's this whole lengthy process of you being ostracized, which really departs from the whole idea about getting people reintegrated, if that's the expression, into society. And I think that's a real problem that we're still suffering with, and I think we will suffer with for a long time. And I think, Will, it's probably about educating people generally about what are the risks for anybody, post conviction or post sentence or whatever, and how do we get far better at having people back into society, and not just as a tokenistic effort. I don't mean just like this is like 1% of employers then start taking people on as we'll take one ex-offender. This is about a proper open conversation. And I say that as the police are being one of the worst offenders, because we'll never employ someone with a criminal conviction. So we need to get better ourselves at being far better at being, not just being the hypocrites at telling everybody else how to do it. We need to get better too about employing people with criminal convictions too, and leading the way.
And I think there's also an element of kind of challenging the thinking and the language that we use. These labels, offender, ex-offender, they've just been problematic for me for a long time. And I know within my organization, whatever your background, whatever your experience, you get the same title. And we never ask anyone to disclose if they, we do a lot of events and a lot of talking and a lot of programs, and it's completely on the individual if they want to disclose their past or not. But it's not part of our curriculum. We use the material that we have because it works, and it's around how we invest in our facilitators and invest in our team in order to be the best that they can be. So all of those labels get taken off unless, that person wishes to identify in that way. The same way that we work with young people around the kind of the gang label. if you identify as being a gang member, that's what we will work you around. If the police or someone else has identified you as a gang member, we're not going to work with that title. That's not a title. That's a title that's been put onto you, rather the title that's been you've kind of claimed for yourself. But also this kind of notion of rehabilitation and interventions that are targeted at the behavior of an individual without putting any context in it. And I think we fail a lot of young people by not taking into consideration the context of their situation, and just putting a lot of the blame on the behavior on themselves. Yes, people are responsible for the choices that they make, yeah, but if those choices are rubbish to begin with, we have to acknowledge that in that process of kind of communicating. And I learned the lesson that years ago, because I created, and I worked with my team kind of, and we just created programs and interventions that we would enjoy, because we were just thinking, okay, these are guys that are in their cells a lot of the time, and how can we actually invest in them and do something that they might actually like. And I remember kind of one of the guys that I was working with, and he was in on a joint enterprise, so he maintained his innocence kind of throughout his sentence. And he came back to me one day and he was like, the reason why I really liked your programs is you didn't actually talk about any of our offending. And I realized at the time, I was like, we really didn't. And these people are still paying us, but that was part of the process. It was challenging thinking. We would think about kind of what is the moral good, and challenge and use a lot of kind of university level kind of thinking processes and critical thinking skills to really push them to think about behavior, but to think about where it comes from, but to also think about other useful skills that would be needed in life. So I think this whole kind of this rehabilitation thing is very much a system doing to and not doing with. And I'm finding that very, very problematic, to the point that we will be moving out of the criminal justice system, and we will be doing a lot more voluntary based kind of work in the community, because once you know better, you have to do better.
I think you've raised some really important points, particularly around about the community and about rehabilitation. And sometimes it can be seen as a little bit of trying to save people, in time we're actually not actually working with people to see what they want. And also regarding the idea of choice, and the fact that choice is not created equal in society. It just isn't. When we actually say, well, people have choices, well, choices are limited and you find yourself down pathways that you can't escape from. How do we then support communities to actually sort of take apart some of those structural problems that we have, some of those structural inequities? And I looked to the comment in the fabulous letter by Marcus Rashford the other day there, and actually about food poverty and about how families like his wouldn't have survived, etc. And actually, it's helped to change government policy, albeit for a short period of time, etc. So how do we create movements? How do we support society? And how do we get to change policy? Fairly big questions that I'm sure we'll solve in the next 5 minutes. Graham.
I just want to commend Marcus Rashford's efforts and sentiment. It was just fabulous, and just shows you how one determined individual can petition a whole government, and change a whole mindset. So it was fantastic. But there's a problem, and it always comes back to when we go back to the root of a lot of these problems, it's poverty. Well, in free market capitalism, unfortunately, poverty and lack is always going to exist. So trying to solve poverty is a fool's errand sometimes, So I think if you break it down and you start looking at some of the components, what does it mean to live in poverty? And if you ask questions, I sometimes juxtapose it and turn it around and say, well, instead of saying, why do all poor kids go to jail? Why don't we ask, see if you're middle class or upper class, why don't they go to jail? Why do they go to university and why do they succeed? And that's when we start to examine. And lots of these questions are about quality of life. And it doesn't always come down to money, by the way. It comes down to much more complex social fabrics. 2 parents on minimum wage can earn the same as, one single parent earning a middle class wage. So it's not just about money. It's not just about poverty. It's about opportunity. And it's about the very first thing we spoke about. It's about hope. And how do you give young people hope? Well, sometimes it's just giving them something tangible to aim for. I worked with people who went to private school and they were privileged, and in school they did rock climbing and they went snowboarding and they did stuff, and they had stuff to aim for. But see, in my community, which is deprived, kids don't, it's that great saying of there's nothing to do. Well, see if we can give ideas. We need to inspire young people. We need to give young people dreams. And sometimes dreams are hard to manifest when all you see is concrete and all you see is trauma, but that doesn't mean that the world's not beautiful and that there's a future out there for you. I think if we can, get young people thinking and dreaming, then it's the first step.
I think there's another element here on we need to rethink how we do democracy. I don't go for small things in life, but how do we make politics more localized, and how can we make budgets more localized, and how do we get the most amount of people involved in that process? It's 2020. Look at technology. Why is there not an app on my phone that allows me to vote for more kind of localized stuff? Why can't I vote for where my council tax is going? Why do we have these systems in place and never rethink them and challenge them? There could be so many different things that's within my community. We shouldn't have charities. Charities are there because government is failing us at the end of the day. And actually, what would happen if all these budgets were split and looked at more locally, and we had a kind of a peace indicator type process where we worked with the communities and everyone within the community to think about what that community needs? How could we localize politics a lot more? Why are there so few people at council meetings? How can we challenge democracy as it is and adapt it and move it forward so more people can be involved?
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, in terms of actually trying to do democracy at a local level, it's really challenging. But how is that going to be affected if we're looking at the current budgetary situation, whereby we're going to probably be in a deep recession? We're going to see services and communities underfunded, and it's going to be much more challenging to secure money for various different organisations and communities. I would suggest we maybe need more democracy there.
I don't buy into this the budgeting stuff. It is how the budgets are being used. I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when COVID and lockdown happened, MPs were giving up to kind of 10 grand in order to adapt their practices to work from home. Now, I haven't fact checked that, but if that is a thing, why was that a thing? You don't need 10 grand to kind of work from home. I think there's a lot of budget out there that is misplaced and misused. And I think that if we looked at it, and also if we look at how funding is given. So a conversation that I had with the Scottish VRU, because I have a particular problem with the London VRU, and I've been vocal about it. And when I phoned up, I have a problem with how kind of tendering is being done at the moment, and who's getting money and why they're getting money and these kind of things. And one of the things that when I kind of spoke to the Scottish VRU it was actually the guys in the Scottish VRU, John and the team went out and found out who was already doing the work and ensured that those who were already doing the work got the support that they needed in terms of actual support in regards of management skills to upscale, and also the funding. Now, if our funding processes are kind of set up in a way where we know all the kind of larger white charities are going to get the money in order to kind of do the work within the Black and brown communities or more localized communities, that's a flawed system. So, I don't necessarily buy into the fact that there isn't money around. It's how is the money being used, and how many of us have the information needed and the time to actually think about these budgets. So I think we do have to challenge these things, and they can be a lot more localized.
Just coming in on that, Will, I think it's a really interesting point around the budget. I found that budgets were just used as an excuse. They're usually not to do something as opposed to do something. There's no money. It's just like, yeah, it's not the answer to everything. And as Whitney said, there's plenty of money out there. It's just, I think, often being used in the wrong places, or there's convoluted process in terms of accessing it. I think in terms of how we involve communities more, this year we're looking at how we can use community capital and people that are already good, who would be fantastic mentors to support our young boys, because most young boys who go through our program. How can we use them more to go and support the people we're trying to support? How can we build on that existing community capital? And I've just come back to the point around hope. I think hope is really important, but it also needs to be tangible and reachable. I think that what often can happen with agencies that we've seen that can get involved in Northamptonshire is that that either promises will be made that aren't kept, or commitments made again that aren't followed through on. And so one of the things we had to be really good at was, let's align someone's hope towards something that's achievable, and we can get them there together. We'll do it together. So I think working on that community capital issue, focusing the hope in terms of it's actually reaching something, and not using budgets as an excuse, and not having some ridiculous process where we go through a process that just doesn't deliver the results. We need something that's not just tokenistic, and that it really does involve communities at a grassroots level, because there's loads for working with communities. We know there's loads of really good people there. There are some fantastic people in communities, but we don't use their skills in terms of trying to help some of the people that, and they're living within those communities. They're just not connected. So how can we better connect those people to others that we're trying to support who may be marginalised, and make them realise they are part of that community, not ostracised from it?
Those are very valuable points. I mean, and this is about connection, that is about trust. And the problem is, if we don't understand who's out there and delivering, and we don't speak to our services, our communities, our small voluntary groups, and realise that those are the ones that are making a difference, how are we going to achieve anything? How are we going to achieve any kind of lasting change? So how do we move, whether it be funding in Northampton, or whether it be funding in London or in Scotland, to actually be more localised, more targeted towards organisations delivering better bang for their buck rather than some of the bigger organisations?
I think so. I've only got a small point to make on this, but I think one of the things that really undermines good budgetary decisions is the arbitrary timescales they're putting on it. Financial years, for example, it's got to be delivered between April this year and March next, and it must be finished by then and tidied up nicely. And then there's no succession planning afterwards. That seems to be a complete fallacy, and often sets groups up where you might become really integrated or dependent on or involved with a service. Youth club, for example, really basic example, the youth club set up under some funding for a year, and then at an arbitrary stage it's just dropped. And I think those, even on a basic level of that, we need to get far better at thinking about longevity, sustainability of funding decisions, and they're made in the right place at the right time.
Graham, your thoughts?
I don't have a lot to say on this because I've never been directly involved, but what I will say is that it's something that's raised often in Lanarkshire, that we as a county are often forgotten in Glasgow's shadow. So I hear lots of teachers desperate for the kind of interventions that they see on a wider scale in big cities, extending into smaller regional localities, and because these problems aren't as vocal and they're not making headlines, doesn't mean they're not there and they're not feeding the same culture. So my only offer on that would just be we need to absolutely have regional sensitive programs, and look at the people that are doing it, but also then look at how the arterial effects of the main city filters into smaller towns and places that need additional support.
Whitney.
Yeah, I second those points. I think timescales, a lot of funding is just, why do we have 3-month funding? I won't even go for a 3-month contract. And then the restrictions on what the money is being allowed to use for. Why are governments setting out the outcomes? Outcomes should be set locally by the community for the community, and funding application processes are rotten. And especially, going through COVID at the moment, and I speak to a lot of small specialist organisations from across the UK who has time to do the funding application, and actually just understanding that sometimes to create a intervention or a program from a organizational perspective isn't necessarily including the community. And actually, how can you create something from start to beginning without then including the people that you are kind of be there working for? So the funding process, like the application process itself, is flawed, because many a times we're expected to say, what the project is, what it's going to look like, and what the outcome's going to be. And actually, there's nothing authentic and organic about that. And unrestricted funding is a lot better. So all of the money we get at the moment is unrestricted funds, and it's done in strong relationships with funders. in order to kind of have that communication through kind of what we're doing. But ultimately, they trust us and we have that good relationship, and we're able to use our money to do kind of as we like, because we're doing it through kind of creating an evidence base and doing it with the people that we're here to serve, not for the people.
That's a really strong word, is trust. I mean, in speeches we talk about trusting our communities, trusting each other, but funders trusting organisations to actually deliver the best value or deliver the best outcomes, whatever those outcomes are. It's really, really, really important. I'm going to kind of just ask a much more generic question of you all just now, in terms of, if I was to say you could change one thing, what one thing do you think would make the biggest difference to your client groups, to your communities, to the challenge that we face just now, and how we can help young people and how we can move away from the current status quo? What would it be?
I would say, from a serve perspective, purely from what we've seen, is a migration from policy to relationships. I think everything is focused about policy, arbitrary level decisions at either it's tier 4 person, tier 3 person. We want to box them nicely into a category that's really unhelpful, and everything seems to be focused on we need to follow a policy or a document or whatever it needs to be, and we've completely moved away from genuine, good, healthy relationships with people. And I think that's what has been evident to me more than anything about why I've had some of the successes we've had, because we've reinvested in relationships. We've ditched policies. We need to be safe, of course, and have safeguarding arrangements. So I don't mean that. What I'm saying is we need to be looking at people as people, not defining them by what we need to deliver to them or for them. And we need to actually start investing in how can we build a relationship. And I think it's uncomfortable because we want to, especially as a cop, we've been trained to deal with things in a process-driven way, but it's entirely possible to depart from it. And I think that would be the thing I'd love to see more across the country, in terms of valuing and developing skills to build good, healthy relationships between everybody, because it's entirely possible for a police officer to build a relationship with somebody who's been marginalised. It's hard to do, but it's entirely possible. When it happens, you can then really start delivering a sustainable and manage a long-term change.
Whitney, which one thing?
I would abolish prisons for the under 25 population and create smaller localized units for those that need the most support.
Again, you'll love to think big, Whitney. Graham?
One thing I always go back to is personal social education, or PSHE, what we call it in Scotland. But I just think it's such a vital tool that's underused. I think as the education system relies on great individuals doing their own thing, and they exist, by the way, like Jerry Diamond out in Clydebank, who's doing everything, and if every teacher was like him, we wouldn't have problem, but it's too often reliant on the individual. It needs to be regional specific, it needs to be proactive rather than reactive. I went to 2 different schools, and one was really good and one was really bad. It just so happened that the one that was really good was my second school, and it was too late to engage. I was already too far into gangs and drugs. My first school, it was just useless and it was wasted time. And I think if we could get the right people doing that, then we would have a chance to capture some. And I don't think it's going to be the cure-all, but I think we miss a vital opportunity to engage kids, to talk about resilience, to talk about issues like the tragic death of George Floyd, in an open forum and discussion kind of way, that we can reduce trauma. That's going to, I think it's such a valuable tool.
Brilliant. It's been some really great conversation today about some of the big issues. Some of the points that's been raised we could talk about all day, and we've only really touched the surface on it. But I would really like to thank you guys for that today. It's been fabulous, and some of the feedback we're getting back online has been great about this. So well done, and thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'd like to say we'll be running our next event on the 8th of July. What we're looking at then is the future of communities, that kind of post-COVID. What do we want and how do we want to get there? Confirmed for the panel so far from that is we've got Darren McGarvey, author of Poverty Safari, and we'll be joined by a couple others. So we're running that on the 8th of July. Again, Facebook, YouTube, don't need to sign up for it, just join us on the day for it as we continue conversations. But thanks for joining us for today. Thanks for those that sent in questions. Sorry I couldn't get to them all. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.